There is a skill that every human being who has ever lived was born knowing how to do. A skill so fundamental that for 300,000 years it needed no instruction, no hospital, no manual. And sometime in the last century we forgot it. Not metaphorically, literally. There are communities on Earth today where nobody remembers how to give birth anymore. And the story of how that happened is one of the strangest things modern medicine has ever documented. Most people, when they think about childbirth, assume the body handles it, that labor is something that happens to you, not something you have to know how to do, that the mechanics are biological and the biology is automatic. That assumption is wrong, and it has been wrong for longer than anyone wants to admit. For most of human history, birth was not a medical event. It was a community one, not in a ceremonial sense, in a functional one. When a woman went into labor, the women around her didn't just offer comfort. They coached her. They repositioned her. They knew from their own bodies and from watching their mothers and grandmothers exactly what to do when things went wrong, when to push, when to wait, when to turn the baby, when to call for help. This knowledge didn't live in books. It lived in bodies. It was transmitted through presence, through watching, through doing. You learned it by being in the room. And for 300,000 years, the room was always full. Then the room emptied. In 1914, the American Medical Association began a coordinated campaign to move childbirth out of homes and into hospitals. The argument was safety, and they were right about the emergencies. Infant mortality was high. Maternal death was common. Hospitals had sterile environments and instruments that could intervene when things went dangerously wrong. But something else happened alongside the safety gains. Something nobody planned for. Something almost nobody tracked. Within 2 generations, the chain broke. By the 1950s, most American women were giving birth sedated, lying flat on their backs, in a room with a physician they had likely never met, surrounded by people whose job was to manage the process so that nothing was required of her but compliance. The knowledge that had lived in female communities for hundreds of thousands of years had nowhere to go. It wasn't suppressed. It wasn't banned. It simply stopped being passed on because the context that had always carried it, the room full of women who had done this before, no longer existed. And here is where it gets stranger. In the 1960s, a French obstetrician named Michel Odent began noticing something in his maternity ward that he could not explain using anything he had been taught in medical school. Women who labored in the typical clinical environment, flat on their backs, monitored, directed, consistently had longer and more complicated labors than women who were allowed to move freely and follow their own bodies. But the more disorienting observation came when Odent began studying traditional birth practices around the world. Cultures where birth had never been medicalized, where the old chain of transmission had never been broken, women moved through labor in ways that looked almost choreographed, not because they had been instructed, because they had seen it, because their bodies carried what they had witnessed even when their conscious minds could not have named it. They squatted, they rocked, they vocalized in specific patterns that research would later show help regulate pain and breathing. They touched specific points on their own bodies without being told why. Odent argued that what he was watching was not instinct in the biological sense. It was something more fragile than instinct. It was embodied cultural knowledge. And embodied cultural knowledge, unlike instinct, can be lost. Anthropologist Brigitte Jordan spent years documenting birth practices across 4 cultures: the United States, Sweden, Holland, and a Mayan community in the Yucatan. Her 1978 book, Birth in 4 Cultures, became one of the foundational texts in the field. What Jordan found was not that some cultures were more advanced than others. What she found was that each culture had developed, over centuries, a specific and internally coherent system of knowledge around birth. They were active agents, drawing on a deep well of transmitted understanding. In the Mayan community Jordan studied, birth was never a solo event. A woman in labor was surrounded by her mother, her mother-in-law, her female neighbors, and a midwife who had attended hundreds of births. Every woman in that room had watched this happen before. Many had done it themselves. The laboring woman was embedded in a living library of experience. Jordan also documented what happened when that library closed. She interviewed American women who had given birth in hospitals in the 1950s and 60s. Women who had been sedated, strapped to tables,
woken up to be handed a baby they had no memory of delivering. Women who, when their own daughters went into labor a generation later, had nothing to offer them. No stories, no guidance, no map. Not because they didn't care, because they had never been in the room. The knowledge had skipped a generation, then another. And by the time researchers started asking questions, the women who had held that knowledge were gone. Not just retired, dead, and what they knew had died with them because it had never been written down. It had never needed to be. This is what anthropologists call a knowledge extinction, not the loss of a fact. The loss of a capability, something that cannot be recovered from a library because it was never stored in one. Something that existed only in the transmission between bodies, in the specific act of one woman watching another, and that transmission had been severed. But here is what nobody talks about when this story gets told. Childbirth is not the only thing this happened to. Jordan's research pointed to something much larger. She argued that what modern medicine had done to birth was a specific example of a general pattern she called the authoritative knowledge problem. In every domain where professional expertise displaces community knowledge, the same thing tends to happen. The professional system wins, not because it is always better in every case, but because it controls the context. It owns the room. And once it owns the room, the old knowledge stops moving. It doesn't vanish immediately. The last generation that holds it is still alive. They still know, but they are no longer in the room where the knowing gets passed on. And when they die, it dies with them. Jordan found this pattern in farming communities, in food preparation, in the care of the elderly, in the management of grief. Everywhere she looked, she found the same quiet extinction happening in slow motion, invisible until it was complete. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We have no reliable way of knowing what else we have already lost. The nature of a knowledge extinction is that it leaves no record. The people who knew are gone. The people who came after don't know what they're missing because they never knew it existed. You cannot feel the absence of something you have never had. The women giving birth in American hospitals in 1965 did not feel robbed of ancient wisdom. They felt grateful for the epidural. They felt relieved that trained professionals were in charge. They had no frame of reference for what had been quietly removed from their world one generation earlier. And that is the most disturbing part of all. Not that we lost something, but that we lost it without noticing, that the knowledge went so quietly, so cleanly, with so little resistance, that by the time anyone thought to look for it, the people who could have told us what it felt like to have it were already gone. For 300,000 years, every woman who ever gave birth did so inside a room full of women who had done it before. That room was not a luxury. It was the technology. It was the accumulated intelligence of hundreds of thousands of years of human experience, carried not in writing, not in institutions, but in the presence of bodies that remembered. We replaced that room with a hospital. And we called it progress. Maybe it was. The survival rates are real. The lives saved are real. Nobody serious is arguing otherwise, but something else is also real. Something that doesn't show up in mortality statistics or clinical outcomes or any metric we currently know how to measure. A thread that ran unbroken from the first human birth to somewhere in the middle of the 20th century has been cut, and we are only beginning to understand what was woven into it.